The Mafia has been known for being not only a calculating criminal superorganism, but also for its rashness and penchant for violence. Over the years, many people have been victims of this violence, but a class of people rarely get to experience it. Sometimes, however, the Mafia sees judges as such big threats that they resort to attacking them. In this video, we'll take a look at some of these situations where Mafia members choose to act out in revenge against judges. Luciano Leggio. Luciano Leggio, also known as Luciano Leggio, is one of the most recognizable names and leading figures of the Sicilian Mafia from the 1940s to the early 1970s. He was as brutal as he was cunning. For decades, he evaded conviction, even when it seemed obvious that he was responsible for the crimes. However, one of the things that would lead to his downfall was when he went a little too far in order to hit on a judge. The end was not what he expected. However, before I get ahead of myself, let's have a look at just who Luciano Leggio was. Born on the 6th of January 1925 in Corleone, Sicily, Luciano was one of 10 children. He was raised on a small farm in extreme poverty. A childhood like that really can mess you up. Having struggled from a very young age, he decided to go into crime. After all, why work to earn when you can just take it from someone else? Like most teenagers who get into crime, Luciano started off small. His first arrest was for stealing corn at the age of 18. Now, considering the kind of childhood that he had, petty theft seemed probable, especially as what he was stealing was food. You'd probably assume that young Luciano wasn't too far gone yet, and the possibility of reform was still there. But then, after serving a 6-month prison sentence, he went on to murder the man who had turned him into the police, which is a drastic turn from stealing corn. It seemed almost instantly that he was already too far gone. Having had a taste for violence and liking it, Luciano wanted more. He got the attention of Michele Navarra, who was the Mafia boss in Corleone. In 1945, Michele recruited him to work as an enforcer and hitman. He was an essential part of the Mafia, taking care of people that his boss wanted to get rid of. In the late 40s, Luciano would meet Salvatore Toto Riina, who we'll discuss later in this video. The two men became close friends and started to work together. For the next decade, things seemed to work fine between Luciano and Michele Navarra, with Luciano rising up to be a right-hand man to the Mafia boss. However, one day things went south. For some reason, Navarra had decided that Luciano had outlived his usefulness, and he invited him over where he had 15 hitmen ready to kill Luciano. However, the hitmen failed in the attempt, which is pretty funny when you think about it. He escaped with minor injuries and knowledge that he had a mark on his head. If he was going to live, he'd have to strike back soon. His plan had to be flawless. There was no room for error or failure. If he gave Navarra even the smallest opportunity, that would be the end. His opportunity to strike back came on the 2nd of August, 1958. And as Navarra and a colleague were driving down an isolated road, two vehicles blocked the open road, and gunmen armed with submachine guns shot at Navarra's Fiat 1100, killing both passengers. After that event, Luciano Leggio solidified his position and became head of the Corleone Mafia. Leggio was a thorn in the side of Italian law enforcement. Even though he was involved in all sorts of illegal activities, which included murder, kidnapping, and extortion, law enforcement could never really hold him accountable successfully. Once, on the 14th of May, 1964, he was arrested to stand trial. One of the counts was the murder of his former boss, Michele Navarra. He was imprisoned at Ucciardone prison in Palermo, and it seemed for a moment that justice would be served. However, this was not to be the case. Even from prison, he continued to run the Mafia, ordering hits and running operations. It seemed like prison was an opportunity to cover his tracks even more. He could not be accused of committing a crime when he was in prison after all. He gained the name Leggio after a mistake in the court records. In 1968, he was acquitted of the charges against him for lack of evidence, and so after 4 years behind bars, he became a free man once again. There was a determined magistrate, however, who not only saw through Leggio and all his tricks, but was determined to bring him to justice. Cesare Terranova wished to bring down the Corleone Mafia, and he was a pain to have to deal with. He appealed against the acquittal and demanded that Luciano Leggio stand trial again. To avoid trial, Luciano checked into a hospital claiming to treat pot disease. After a while of treatment, he left for Milan. He continued his reign of terror and violence, but he did not forget Cesare Terranova. On the 16th of May, 1974, Luciano was captured in Milan. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1975 and imprisoned at the Badue Carros prison in Nuoro, Sardinia. However, not even prison could stop Luciano from exacting his revenge on Cesare Terranova. In 1979, he, with the approval of the Sicilian Mafia Commission, ordered the assassination of Judge Terranova. Terranova was killed with an explosive as he drove by mafioso Giovanni Brusca. Ironically, even though it was basically general knowledge that Luciano was responsible for the murder, when he was charged, he was acquitted for lack of evidence, both in the first trial, which was held in Reggio Calabria in 1983, and 3 years later, in 1986, in the appeal process. Still, Luciano Leggio spent the rest of his life in prison. On the 15th of November 1993, he died in prison from a heart attack at the age of 68. Toto Riina. Now we go to a person who is perhaps more infamous than Leggio, Salvatore Riina. The stories of his brutality are almost legendary, and there's no way to avoid this name when studying the history of the Mafia in Italy. However, his infamy is rightly earned, meaning that Toto Riina is one of the biggest, most brutal criminals of all time. Now you're probably wondering what he could have possibly done to have such a reputation. Well, if you didn't already know about Toto Riina, allow me to educate you. Salvatore Toto Riina was born in Corleone on the 16th of November 1930. Just like Luciano Leggio, he was also born into a life of poverty. However, there was also the element of grief in young Toto's life. In September of 1943, when he was just 13 years old, his father Giovanni found an unexploded American bomb and attempted to open it to sell the powder and metal. However, he made a mistake and instead set it off, killing himself and Rina's 7-year-old brother Francesco, while injuring his other brother Gaetano. Perhaps it was growing up having next to nothing, or perhaps it was unresolved issues as a child with the loss of his father and brother that made Toto turn to a life of crime. Perhaps it was something else. We'd never really know. However, the teenage Toto was quite the menace. When he was just 19 years old, he was charged with the murder of a man named Domenico Di Matteo. He was sentenced to a 12-year prison sentence and was released in 1956. As stated previously, it was while he was in prison for murder that he met the dangerous Luciano Leggio, and the two men became close associates. Toto was favored by Leggio, and soon he became one of his closest associates and executors. Toto was more brutal than Leggio, and even though the ordered assassinations of many of Leggio's enemies came from Leggio himself, it was often Toto Riina who pulled the trigger. After Michele Navarra had been killed and Luciano Leggio became the boss of the Mafia, Toto became his right hand. He, together with many other associates of Leggio, spent years hunting down and killing those still loyal to the now dead Navarra. However, all the killings started to gather a lot of attention from law enforcement, which was really bad for business. Arrest warrants were issued for him, and so in order to avoid incarceration again, Toto went into hiding. In 1969, after Luciano Leggio had gotten out of prison the first time for a lack of evidence, Toto Riina and Leggio were arrested and tried for numerous murders carried out over the years. They didn't have any intention of going to prison again though, and so they did everything in their power to ensure that the case didn't go far. By everything in their power, I mean they basically harassed and intimidated the jury and witnesses until it was impossible to convict them of the crimes. They were eventually acquitted. When Luciano once again was imprisoned in the 70s, Toto essentially took over as head of the Corleone Mafia. Luciano Leggio maintained some form of control of the Mafia, but over time he left more responsibilities to Toto. Toto's reign as boss of the Mafia was one filled with unprecedented violence. He wanted as much control as possible, and he did not mind going to war for it. He also, unlike other Mafia leaders before him, was not really big on staying low-key and not raising a lot of suspicion. Basically, what he could not solve with violence, he'd try to solve with even more violence. Toto went to war with people he considered rivals, which included Stefano Bontad, Salvatore Inzerillo, who I'll also talk about later in this video, and Tano Badalamenti, who were bosses of various powerful Palermo Mafia families. It was a bloody war, known to many as the Second Mafia War. It was an extremely bloody affair, and up to 1,000 people died in the conflict. Toto's brutal tactics seemed to work, and he, together with their allies, wiped out their rivals. By the end of the war, he was effectively ruling the Mafia. Toto's violence was not exclusive to rival Mafia families, though. He ordered the murders of judges, policemen, and prosecutors in an attempt to terrify the authorities and maintain control. He was arrested and tried in the Maxi trial. He hoped that his usual tactics would work. However, this was not to be. You see, the judge in charge of the trial was a man named Giovanni Falcone. You see, Falcone was very tough on crime and was especially against the Mafia. He convicted 338 people in the Maxi trial, including Toto in absentia. This decision was upheld at the Supreme Court of Cassation. This angered Toto a lot, and he decided that someone had to be punished for it. In January 1992, the Council of Top Bosses, headed by Riina, reacted by ordering the assassination of Giovanni Falcone and his colleague, Salvatore Lima. Toto was in hiding during this time, and it became a priority of the government to find and apprehend him. A year later, one of Toto Riina's associates, Balduccio Di Maggio, who was scared that his boss wanted him dead, fled and decided to work with the authorities in return for protection. On the 15th of January 1993, Toto Riina was arrested at his villa in Palermo. After his arrest, he received multiple life sentences for various murders that he had committed over the years. It seemed like he was receiving accountability for all the years of violence he had committed. He died on the 17th of November, 2017, a day after his 87th birthday. He died while in a medically induced coma after 2 operations in the prison unit of the Maggiore Hospital in Parma. The specific cause of death was not revealed. At the time of his death, he was still considered to be the head of the Cosa Nostra. Kirksey Nix. One of the lesser-known mafias is the Dixie Mafia, and when you really think about it, it comes as no surprise that they aren't that well known. When you hear Mafia, the first image that comes to mind is of La Cosa Nostra, or the American Mafia, that have not only made their way into mainstream media, but also has distinct, recognizable elements. You also don't imagine them originating from Mississippi, which is where the Dixie Mafia does originate from. They also don't follow the traditional theme of having a family. They instead are more according to the FBI. The Dixie Mafia had no ties to La Cosa Nostra. They were a loose confederation of thugs and crooks who conducted their criminal activity in the southeastern United States. When word got out that Biloxi, with its history of strip clubs and illicit gambling, was a safe haven, the criminals settled in. It was in this mafia that the next person on this list, Kirksey Nix, made his name. Kirksey McCord Nix was quite an interesting character. Born in 1943 in Oklahoma, Kirksey Nix was online the previous names on this list. He wasn't born into poverty. As a matter of fact, his family was quite distinguished. His father, Kirksey McCord Nix Sr., was a widely respected jurist in the Sooner State, and he served in both the Oklahoma House of Representatives and the state Senate before taking a seat on the bench of the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. That by itself sounds pretty impressive, but then Kirksey's mother, Patricia, was just as impressive. She was one of the first women to practice law in Oklahoma. Kirksey first went to Biloxi in 1962 as a 19-year-old airman stationed at Keesler Air Force Base. One would think that having the kind of parents he had, he'd have an interest in politics or the humanities, but this was certainly not the case. He instead was more interested in illegal activities. While he had gotten into trouble with the authorities a few times while in Oklahoma, it wasn't until he got to Mississippi that he got drawn into a life of crime properly. He had met an associate of his father, a man named Mike Gillick, who owned a series of motels and nightclubs down the strip. These places were also hot spots for all sorts of illegal activities like gambling and prostitution. Kirksey fit in just fine, and soon he and Mike Gillick became friends and started to work together. At first, Kirksey Nix was an employee for Gillick. He helped organize many of his operations, but soon he started to make a name for himself in the criminal underworld. From running petty scams to gambling to drugs and prostitution, he was involved in anything he could get his hands on. His use of the motels on the strip meant that he also met and collaborated with other criminals, and soon he gathered a group of misfits who were always looking to make money, no matter the cost. Mike Gillick's businesses became a meeting point for these people, and soon they formed an organization known as the Dixie Mafia, with Kirksey Nix at the top of the organization. The Dixie Mafia was responsible for many atrocities, including murder. The first major murder they were accused of was the murder of Sheriff Buford Pusser's wife, Pauline. According to E.A. Pusser, who was also targeted but survived, he had been contacted on the morning of the 12th of August, 1967, with information about a disturbance on New Hope Road in McNairy County. Pusser responded, and his wife Pauline rode along. Shortly after they passed the New Hope Methodist Church, a car pulled up beside them and opened fire, killing Pauline and leaving Pusser seriously injured. However, neither Kirksey Nix nor the rest of the Dixie Mafia ever took responsibility for this crime, nor were they able to be convicted for it. Kirksey did eventually get convicted for the murder of a different man, though. In 1972, he was convicted for the murder of a man named Frank Corso, who was a New Orleans grocery executive while breaking into his home, and began serving a life sentence without parole. He was also convicted later for his involvement in the 1987 murder-for-hire killing of Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife, City Councilwoman Margaret Sherry. Nix continued to be a criminal even from within the confines of prison. He set up a scam preying on lonely gay men who he made send money to him. He would put advertisements in newspapers. When men responded to these ads, he would indicate that he was having financial difficulties and needed money wired to him. He hoped that he'd get enough money through these scams to be able to buy his way out of prison, and he made hundreds of thousands running these scams. However, things didn't go to plan, and he eventually was caught. When he was interrogated, he had this to say.
Janis Joplin said, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. If you're not ever going to let me out of prison, and I'm doing a life sentence, I felt like, what the hell? I'm going to do what I want to do.
He was again convicted of wire fraud in addition to his previous convictions, and is currently still in prison at the Federal Correctional Institution in El Reno, Oklahoma, where he will most likely spend the rest of his life. Mike Gillick became a state informant in return for a reduced sentence. In July of 2000, after spending 9 years in prison, he was released. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 82. Salvatore Inzerillo. We go back now to Italy, where the next person on this list, Salvatore Toto Inzerillo, ruled as a prominent figure of the Sicilian Mafia. At the height of his power, he was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in all of Italy. He was born on the 20th of August, 1944. It seemed destined from his birth that he would be a part of the Mafia. He was the nephew of the mafioso Rosario Di Maggio. Di Maggio was a part of the Mandamenti Passo di Rigano, which itself was a part of the Palermo Mafia. Having such close ties to the Mafia meant that he basically grew up heavily influenced by it. He went on to marry Rosario's daughter, his cousin Giuseppe Di Maggio. He solidified his place within the family and started to build his own reputation. When his uncle died, Salvatore succeeded him and became a member of the Sicilian Mafia Commission. The Inzerillo family was related by marriage to not only the Di Maggio family, but also the Spatola family and the Gambino family in New York. Salvatore anchored on this to form a partnership with the families that established ventures based on collective interest. The way he saw it, everyone made money and everyone was happy. The families decided that the sale of heroin was going to be their way. After all, this was the 70s, when the heroin trade was quite popular. They weren't the only ones dealing in it, but they were really successful at it. They would receive morphine base from Turkey, process it into heroin in Sicily, and then transport it and sell it in America. The Gambino family was an important cog in this operation, as they were the ones with the connection and power in America to sell the product. It made them all quite wealthy. They were even able to bring in people like Stefano Bontade into the mix. The Inzerillo Spatola Di Maggio Gambino network and other Sicilian suppliers dominated heroin trafficking from the mid-70s until the mid-80s, when U.S. and Italian law enforcement were able to finally get their bearings and clamp down on the trafficking. By then, the families had made millions. According to Giovanni Falcone, yes, the same Falcone who was killed by Toto Riina, who was assigned the task of investigating the heroin trafficking case, the group had made about $600 million. They were a big pain for law enforcement to deal with, and prosecutors tried day and night to bring the families to justice. According to the Palermo prosecuting office, these four families, living partly in Sicily and partly in New York, form a single clan unlike anything in Italy or the United States, the most potent family in Cosa Nostra. John Gambino is the converging point in the United States for all of the group's activities in Italy and the final destination for its drug shipments. Salvatore Inzerillo has emerged as the Gambino brothers' principal interlocutor, the central personage in Sicily with myriad interests and heavy capital investments. Rosario Spatola is just below them in structure. The sale of heroin wasn't all that Salvatore Inzerillo was involved in. He was a member of the Mafia after all, and violence was often used as a tool to intimidate and deal with enemies. As previously stated, judges were usually not targets of the Mafia. However, sometimes certain judges annoyed the Mafia enough to warrant their attention and attacks. One judge to do this was Gaetano Costa, who had signed 53 arrest warrants against the Spatola Inzerillo Gambino clan and their heroin trafficking network in May 1980. Salvatore Inzerillo was no doubt angered by this, and he ordered the assassination of the judge. Gaetano Costa was murdered on the 6th of August 1980. However, a mistake that Salvatore made was acting without asking the permission from the Mafia Commission before the hit. Permission was needed since the assassination was planned to happen in rival territory, and he needed to prove that he could do it without pissing the rivals off and triggering aggression. This act triggered the Corleonesi, headed by Toto Riina, to act. On the 11th of May 1981, Salvatore Inzerillo was leaving the house of his mistress in Palermo when he was gunned down by a hail of AK-47 bullets as he walked to his car. Ironically, the car was new and bulletproof, and if he had managed to make it into the car before the shootout, he probably wouldn't have been killed that day. The death of Salvatore Inzerillo, as well as Stefano Bontade, who was killed a month before him, triggered the start of the Second Mafia War, which went on for almost 2 years and saw hundreds of people killed as Toto Riina and the Corleonesi decimated their rivals in order to take over La Cosa Nostra. The Second Mafia War saw a lot of casualties from the Inzerillo family. One of Salvatore's sons and his brother-in-law were some of the casualties, as well as many of his partners and associates. At the end of it all, Toto Leggio came out on top, at the cost of the decimation of multiple families in the Mafia. However, not every member of the Salvatore Inzerillo family was killed, and with the help of some families like the Gambinos, they managed to make it out of Sicily and to New York with the promise that they would never return. However, things changed in 2004 when Rosario Inzerillo, a brother of Salvatore, returned to Palermo with the approval of Salvatore Lo Piccolo, one of the leading Mafia bosses. Salvatore Inzerillo's only surviving son, Giovanni Inzerillo, returned as well to reopen the family house after 25 years. This move has made people like Antonio Rotolo, who is an ally of the Corleonesi, quite nervous as he expects the Inzerillo to want vengeance for what happened during the Second Mafia War. Bernardo Provenzano, a name you've almost definitely heard of if you're a big fan of the history of the Mafia, is Bernardo Provenzano. The Phantom of Corleone, as he was called, was a very prominent figure in the Mafia, gaining the title Boss of all Bosses and known for his calculative mind and discipline. Bernardo was born in Corleone, Sicily, on the 31st of January 1933. He was the third of 7 children, and his parents, Angelo Provenzano and Giovanna Rigoglioso, were farmers. Coming from a humble family, Bernardo Provenzano didn't have a lot growing up. In the 2nd grade, he left school to assist his father on his farm. It seems like the sort of thing that a little child shouldn't be forced to do. But then again, the family was poor. Growing up, he was heavily influenced by the Mafia. This was Corleone, after all, where the Mafia had one of its strongest holds in the 20th century. He wanted to be a part of that life, and as soon as he could, he became a part of the Mafia. Being in the Mafia has its perks. For one, it pays, literally. It also affords you a fair amount of influence. No one wanted to mess with the Mafia, even if it was with a foot soldier. Bernardo started to work under Luciano Leggio, and he became one of his key enforcers. He started off as a bodyguard, and then was put in charge of the family's slaughterhouses. In August of 1958, Bernardo was one of the 14 gunmen who backed mob boss Luciano Leggio in the ambush and murder of Michele Navarra, who was up until his death the head of the Mafia. Following his death, Leggio became the head. Over the next 5 years, he helped Leggio hunt down and kill many of Navarra's surviving supporters. He himself would have a close shave with death when he was shot in the head during a confrontation with men loyal to Navarra. He would later tell the police when interrogated that he had no idea who or why he had been shot. According to him, he had just been at home with his mother and brothers. After having a meal with them, he decided to go to the cinema when he felt something hit him in the head and passed out. The police were skeptical about his account, but they did not have the evidence to dispute it. The more he did for Leggio, the more he could trust him, and the higher up in the Corleonese he went. He decided that he would catch up on the education that he missed as a child and started taking math lessons from a man named Vito Ciancimino. This paid off, and he became so skilled at accounting that he began to be known as the accountant within the family. When Luciano Leggio was captured by police in 1974, Salvatore Riina basically became the head of the family, and Bernardo Provenzano became his right-hand man. He was known to be quite calculating and careful, and with all the violence that he had perpetuated, he also was known to be smart and focus on deals that made the family more money. However, he was actively involved in the Second Mafia War. He continued as one of Toto Riina's most trusted lieutenants until Toto's arrest in 1993. After the arrest in a meeting at Villabate, it was decided that both Bernardo Provenzano and Leo Luca Bagarella would take charge of controlling the Corleonese. However, just 2 years later, Bagarella himself was arrested, and Bernardo took the reins of the Corleonese and all of Cosa Nostra solely. By this time, however, he had already been sentenced to life in absentia in 1987 at the Maxi trial. Bernardo Provenzano has been convicted in the murder of multiple judges. Apart from being convicted for the murders of Cesare Terranova and Giovanni Falcone, he was also found to have killed other judges throughout his criminal career. For example, in 1999, Provenzano was sentenced to life imprisonment in absentia in the trial against those responsible for the Via D'Amelio massacre, in which the judge Paolo Borsellino and 5 of his escort men lost their lives. Again, in 2002, he was sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment for the murder of Judge Rocco Cinici. He received this sentence together with Salvatore Riina, Salvatore Buscemi, and other members of the Mafia. For years, Bernardo evaded arrest. No matter what the police did to try and find him, he just always seemed to be one step ahead. The police had numerous raids in an attempt to find the Phantom of Corleone, but the more they searched, the more it seemed like the man was really a ghost. For a long time, the only thing that the police knew for sure was that he was still alive and still running the Mafia, even into the 21st century. Their big break came when he was finally found and captured on the 11th of April 2006 by the Italian police near his hometown Corleone. One of the reasons it took so long for the police to locate Bernardo Provenzano was his avoidance of technology. He knew that he could be traced, and so he refused to use telephones or faxes, and instead issued orders through small hand-delivered notes called pizzini. The pizzini were written in code and could only be decrypted with a very specific cipher. He was so careful that it had to take police tracking a delivery of laundry from his wife's house to his hideout before his location was revealed and he was captured. By this time, he had been a fugitive for over 40 years. Bernardo Provenzano died on the 13th of July, 2016 at the San Paolo Hospital in Milan from complications from bladder cancer. He was 83 years old at the time of his death. He was cremated and his family buried his ashes in Corleone. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to watch another fascinating video like this, click on one of the boxes on your screen right now.